Hey everyone, this video is all about my top 5 camera setting secrets which really helped me out when I first started out with photography and which I wish I'd known earlier. So these are not really secrets as such, but when I was first starting out in photography and I found these things out for the first time, it kind of did feel like I was uncovering secrets which really did help me improve my photography in the early days. So I thought I'd share them with you now, and if you're starting out too, perhaps they'll help you. So let's dive in and get on with the tips. Number 1. Okay, so there are 2 types of movement which can cause blur in your images. One is the subjects within your image moving around, such as birds or people, and the other is your own movement. As you hold the camera, you might be shaking slightly or moving, and that can cause blur. And that can happen when your shutter speed is not fast enough, and the long shutter speed will record the motion as you move or your subjects move, and that will look like blur in your image. This is not so much of a problem if you're using a tripod. If you've got it fixed firmly to your tripod, you're not really going to have to worry about your own movement so much, only the movement of your subjects in the image. But what if you're shooting handheld? How do you know what shutter speed to select to ensure that your own movement doesn't cause blur in your images? Well, there's a handy rule of thumb that you can use which will help you out with this. And basically what you do is take your focal length. So if I were using my 70 to 200mm lens here and I'm set at the 200mm mark, I would take 200 and I would use that as the denominator in my shutter speed. So I would use 1/200, 1/200th of a second. And that roughly will give you a fast enough shutter speed to ensure that when you're using that focal length handheld, you're not going to get blur. So if you're using 50mm, you use 1/50th of a second. If you're using 100mm, 1/100th of a second, and so on. And generally this works really well. But I often go a little bit higher as well, particularly if I'm taking photos of birds or something that's moving fast. And I'll actually double the focal length number. So for example, if I'm shooting at 500mm, I would use a minimum of 1/1000th of a second. And that'll give me enough speed when I'm taking that shot to capture my image without getting any kind of blur, and it'll be a nice sharp shot. Number 2. When I first started out, I'd heard that raising your ISO can introduce noise and grain into your image, and it could reduce the detail and quality of the image. And while this is true, it does introduce more noise. It doesn't mean that you don't want to raise your ISO, and it was really beneficial for me to learn that ISO is just a part of the exposure triangle, and learning how that all works and that you can actually raise your ISO when necessary was really valuable to me and really improved my images. So with photography, you're always just trying to get the right amount of light into the camera to get a good exposure and a good image. But it's not always practical to reduce your shutter speed to let more light in, or to widen your aperture to let more light in, because reducing your shutter speed is going to cause motion blur potentially, and widening your aperture might give you too shallow a depth of field. So at some point you're going to need to raise your ISO, and even though it might introduce some more noise into your image, you're going to end up with a better image overall. And even if you're using a tripod, like I said, you're not going to get your own movement causing blur in the image, but if you get a little bit of breeze causing the leaves and the trees to blur, you're going to, with a slow shutter speed, you're going to record that blur. So even on a tripod, use the tools available to you and raise your ISO if necessary. Don't be like me and think that you just have to keep a minimum ISO at all times, because you're going to get better images if you actually raise your ISO when necessary. Number 3. Stop down to increase sharpness in your images. So when I first started out, sometimes I found that my images were a little bit blurry and soft, particularly around the edges of the frame. And what I found out was that this is caused by shooting wide open, so shooting with your aperture as wide as it'll go for the lens that you're using. And this tends to happen with cheaper lenses, but it can even happen with the more expensive lenses as well. And you can get around this by just stopping down a little bit. So that means increasing your f number to narrow your aperture, and even just increasing your f number by 1 or 2 stops can really help to improve the sharpness in your image. And obviously there's going to be times where you need to shoot wide open if you want that shallow depth of field, or if you're not getting enough light into your camera. But if you can afford to do so, stopping down just a little bit will really help improve the sharpness in your image. Just make sure you don't go too high, say above f18, 20, because then you start to introduce a phenomenon known as diffraction, and that'll actually start to soften your images again. So yeah, not wide open, but not too high, and you're going to get sharp images. Number 4. Okay, so this one's a really big topic, and I'm condensing it down into a really headline message here. But this little tip really helped me to reduce blown out highlights in my images when I was first starting. And there's also another caveat to this, which I'll come to in a moment. So let's say you're on a mountaintop with a beautiful scene in front of you and an amazing sunrise, and you're just taking one shot of that image. You're not bracketing, that's another subject, I'm not going to cover that now. But you're just getting one shot of that image, and you've got quite a lot of dynamic range there because you've got a bright sky and quite a dark foreground. So what you're going to need to do, you're going to need to either get your sky right and your foreground too dark, or get your foreground right and then the sky's going to be too bright. And then when you bring that into your editing software, presuming you've been shooting in RAW, you can change the highlights or the shadows and correct the bit that's too dark or too bright. And the tip here that I'm giving you is when you're first starting out, get your highlights right, and don't worry if your foreground's too dark, because it's much easier in your editing software to bring up your shadows and get detail back there than it is to bring down the highlights and get detail back in blown out highlights. If you expose for your foreground and get that right, but you've got your highlights too bright and you've blown them out, no matter what you do, you can't reduce your exposure in your software to get those details back, they're lost. So that's my tip, get the highlights right, bring up the shadows. However, here's the caveat. As you get more advanced in photography, you'll hear people say exposed to the right. And what they mean by that, they're talking about the histogram. And the histogram is information about your image. And the left-hand side of the histogram will give you information about the dark areas, and the right-hand side will give you information about the bright areas, the highlights. So when they say exposed to the right, they mean go as far as you can to the right of the histogram and as bright as possible, but without blowing out your highlights. And that's the key part here, because if you blow out the highlights, you can't get the information back. As a beginner, it's really difficult to expose to the right and not blow out your highlights. So that's why my tip is get your highlights right, don't worry about your shadows, and bring up your shadows later. As you get more confident with your photography, you can start to experiment and start going further to the right. Number 5. I think a lot of photographers, myself included when I started out, have this notion that using manual mode is the only way to go for professionals. And I think that couldn't be further from the truth, really. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's really important to be able to use manual mode, and there'll be times when you have to use it because you won't be able to get the results you want with the priority modes. And it's a really good way of understanding the exposure triangle, because you have to set the shutter speed and the aperture and ISO all manually, and you get a really good understanding of how they balance and work together. But once you've mastered that, it can be so useful to let the camera do a bit of work for you and just put it into one of the priority modes. It'll just save you so much time, and you'll get shots that you wouldn't have been able to get when you messing about with all the different settings. I tend to use aperture priority mode most of the time, and once it's in that mode, all I need to do is set my aperture so that I'm getting the right amount of light into the camera and I've got the right depth of field that I want. And then the camera will automatically set the shutter speed accordingly to balance out and get the right exposure for the image that I'm shooting. And that doesn't mean that I'm not paying attention to the shutter speed. I'll set my aperture, but I'll be keeping an eye on what that does to the shutter speed. And if it drops too low, then I'll increase my ISO so that the shutter speed starts going back up. And if it gets too high, it means I can drop my ISO down, and that's a bonus. But it just saves a lot of time, and there'll be times when, if you're trying to manually adjust all your settings, you might miss a shot. So let the camera do a bit of work, and it'll save you a lot of time and increase your enjoyment of using the camera, and you might even get some shots that you wouldn't have otherwise got. So they're my top 5 secrets which really helped me out when I was first starting with photography. And if you're a beginner and you're just starting out, I hope they'll really help you and help to improve your photography too. So that's it for this one. I hope you've enjoyed it. I don't always do this kind of thing. Sometimes I'm out and about doing landscapes, or I might be doing wildlife or macro. So if you like all things photography and you're not subscribed yet, then why not do so? You can click on the big red button down there or on my face over here. and then you'll keep up to date with what I'm doing each week. And there's a new video every Sunday morning at 10 AM. So I hope you'll catch me for the next one, but until then, thanks a lot and bye for now.